Hello, I'm Jimmy. Welcome to Philosophy for Everyday Life. This is my weekly or so live streamed philosophy hour, and it's part of a series called Kant for Everyone, where we are reading out loud some of the writings of Immanuel Kant. So, just as I'm getting started, I'm going to make sure everything is good with the live stream. Yes, we are good. It's raining here in Chicago. I have a little coffee, which is nice. So let's just jump into a few introductory matters. Before I get started, I'm going to make sure I have my microphone here. Before I get started, I want to mention that I'll be doing a 6-week philosophy intensive called Cultivating an Intellectual Life, starting the week of May 4th. And this intensive will be an opportunity to work with 11 other members of the cohort. We're going to read texts, we're going to discuss ideas, we'll have some personal reflection, and it will be an opportunity to think about what it means to cultivate, to build, to live an intellectual life, whether you are part of a university or a college community, or whether you are totally unconnected from anything like that. And the question I've had for a long time is, what is this life or this vocation? What does it look like to live it out and to do so with others in any setting? And how can we make that more available to anyone who wants to pursue it? So that's my goal on this channel. That's part of what I'm about. And if you're interested, there's a link to a Google form where you can express your interest and share a little bit more about yourself. And if you do fill that form out, I'd love to meet with you just briefly to chat and get to know you and to see whether it might be a good fit. There are a few things I've been saying across this live stream series. And I just want to hit some highlights for anyone who might be new, who might be jumping in, or who needs a little bit of review. The first thing I've been saying is that learning to read philosophy is like learning a language. And the best way to learn a language is to immerse yourself. And what you'll find if you've had this experience before is that learning a language, it just takes some time. It's uncomfortable and it feels confusing and it feels very disorienting. It can, at least. And learning philosophy is much the same. When you crack open a work like the Critique of Pure Reason, it might sound totally foreign. And even words that you think you know that sound familiar might be used in ways that are very hard to make sense of. And it can be easy to become discouraged at this point, especially because the process of reading these works can be slow and tedious. So what I'm trying to do here is to translate in a way, or to invite you into a process of learning this language of philosophical discourse. Rather than giving you a summary or a translation, I'm sort of inviting you to practice speaking the language here. Kant is quite difficult, but he sets the terms for much subsequent philosophical discourse. So if you want to read Hegel or Nietzsche or Heidegger or Kierkegaard or even modern analytic philosophy, you will have a much better sort of linguistic context for doing that if you understand how Kant works. So that's why I'm doing Kant. I think he is foundational for the entire modern philosophical discourse, both continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. And he's also just a rich and rewarding thinker. As I've mentioned a couple of times, this is from the introduction to the Paul Guyer and Alan Wood translation of the Critique of Pure Reason. They say that to write the history of the influence of that book would just be to write the history of Western philosophy since Kant. And I think they are quite right about this. I already mentioned the idea of philosophy as a practice or a way of life. But in learning this language, the goal isn't just to learn some cool ideas, but also to transform one's life in deep ways. And I have experienced this from reading Kant over the last decade. he has transformed the way I think, the way I view the world, the way I think about who I am and what I'm up to. And I think there's no better way to pursue that transformation than in conversation with others. So that's part of the purpose of this live stream in this series. I've developed this phrase that I think the intellectual life is an examined life with friends. And I'm basically putting together pieces from Plato or Socrates and Aristotle. Of course, Socrates said an examined life is not worth living. But Aristotle said that without friends, no one would desire to live. And he also has a lot to say about the role of friendship in the intellectual life. So I've kind of, taken those and made my own thing out of it, which is this idea that living an intellectual life is to live an examined life with friends. And I think we can do that in part by reading texts together and discussing them and sort of wrestling and learning about them together. I've already mentioned why Kant is important. I just want to lay out a few frameworks for thinking about his work, which I've done in previous live streams, but I think they bear repeating. And hello, if you're here. Feel free to drop your name in the chat if you'd like to introduce yourself, or if you have questions or comments, I would truly welcome them. So here's the first frame that I want to offer, and this is what I learned in history of philosophy when I was an undergraduate, which is that you can represent the history of modern philosophy like this, with two main traditions. One is rationalism, and the other is empiricism. What Kant did is to take both of those traditions and identify real weaknesses in each. If I were going to sort of name the defining weaknesses of these two traditions, as I think Kant understands them, it would be that rationalism as a tradition, as a philosophical tradition, tends toward dogmatism. These are the right metaphysical, philosophical truths. You should accept them. It takes a dogmatic procedure without, as Kant would say, critically analyzing the faculty of reason beforehand. The problem with empiricism is that it tends towards skepticism. We can't know anything at all. Kant thinks this position is self-defeating. It undermines itself. It's not a stable position. Of course, the most important representative of this tradition for Kant was David Hume, which leads us to three crises that I think precipitated the work that Kant did in philosophy. The first was Newtonian physics. Newton undermined the Aristotelian understanding of the natural world, which was dominant for not forever, because Aristotle was lost to Europe until the Middle Ages, when his work was discovered and reintegrated by especially authors like Thomas Aquinas. But that picture held for a good 500 years in Europe, or longer, 500 to 600 years. It was starting to be challenged even by the time of Descartes. But after Newton, that picture was fundamentally broken. And it wasn't a challenge just for science, but it was also a challenge for philosophy to come up with a way of thinking about the natural world and how we can have knowledge of it that seemed stable and coherent. So Kant is responding to this challenge, and much of his early work is actually in sort of science adjacent, natural sciences adjacent topics. And even in the Critique of Pure Reason, he uses analogies from science all the time. We've seen this already in the preface. Later on, he'll use analogies from optics to illustrate his philosophical ideas. So Kant was very engaged with physics, especially, and with this crisis that was generated by the rise of Newtonian physics. A second crisis was the rise of biblical criticism. Do the Gospels reliably tell us actual historical events about Jesus? How do we deal with apparent contradictions or real contradictions in these narratives and these accounts? Did Moses write the Pentateuch as is traditionally thought? What about all of these other events, miracles, and so on and so forth? Traditional ideas about religion came under serious pressure from the rise of biblical criticism. And Kant is very engaged with this. It created a whole religious and theological crisis. And, we may circle back to this question because we're going to talk today about this idea of denying knowledge to make room for faith. What does Kant mean by faith? Something new and something old at the same time, I think. But biblical criticism it created a big crisis, and Kant is very engaged with this. And that's related to this third crisis, which is Humean skepticism. Hume raised this question of whether what we think to be natural laws, such as cause and effect, can actually be known to be laws, true laws in a real sense. Or is this just what we've seen up to this point? We have seen so far that the sun rises every morning, but do we know for certain, with real philosophical certainty, that it will rise again tomorrow? Hume said, no, it's just a habit. It's just what we've seen so far. So there's a real question here of skepticism that is related to both of the two prior crises. We have a crisis, a sort of skeptical crisis of religious belief, and also a crisis about the whole project of the natural sciences. Kant is engaged with all of this. Now, in the background, we have two other things which I'm not satisfied with any of my ways of representing these, but maybe I'll just number them. I think Kant is very engaged with Augustinian Christianity. I don't say Augustine specifically. Augustine was a Christian theologian who wrote in the 300s and 400s. He is the most influential theologian of the Western theological tradition, I think, hands down. I don't know that Kant was engaged directly with Augustine, but he is very much engaged with the tradition of theology that comes from Augustine. I'm just going to have to sort of state that for now, and over time, as it shows up, I'll discuss it in more detail. The other thing is, I think Kant is very engaged with Aristotle, especially his logic, but not exclusively. I think he uses logical terms from Aristotle in a way that I have not seen scholars discuss, and I just personally find it helpful to know that he's getting these terms, for example, like antinomy, or there's some other ones that are not jumping to mind right now, but he's getting these terms from Aristotle, and he's working within a framework that is broadly Aristotelian. Of course, Plato is also in the background. This is maybe a more common idea, and we're going to actually turn to Plato today. I could add that as a third, but I'm just going to leave Augustinian Christianity, which kind of includes Plato, and Aristotle as very important pieces of the background in what Kant is up to. Okay. Hey, we have a couple comments here. Welcome. I'm glad you're here, Box Draper, and Snake and Eggs. I'm glad you're here, Frank. Hello. Dogmatic slumber. Yeah, that's the Kant famously says that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers. Isn't Hume just correct about that, though? Why is it a crisis? Why is skepticism a problem? Yeah, we'll get to that. It might be worth doing a whole session on why Kant thinks skepticism is self-defeating, because he truly thinks that to affirm, yeah, you have it here in your next comment, to affirm a skeptical position is self-contradictory in an important way. And Kant is going to say, yes, Hume is correct up to a point, but we can actually bring logically necessary laws to science, and this is what he thinks of the sort of categories of the understanding, the a priori forms of understanding, doing. Thank you both for jumping in. Very glad you're here. I think we are ready to jump into the preface now. This is where we are. So glad you're here. So what we discussed last time is this Copernican revolution that Kant thought he had undertaken um, in philosophy. And you see in the way he talks about the Copernican revolution, you see how invested he is in thinking of metaphysics or philosophy as a science that can proceed with the same kind of confidence as the natural sciences. He really wants us to say that he is putting metaphysics on this path of certainty where you can actually accumulate and build knowledge that is a sort of permanent fund of knowledge moving forward for humanity. And he really wants to think of himself as doing for metaphysics what some unnamed person did for, the geometry early on, or mathematics, and what happened more recently with Newton in physics. Of course, Kant didn't know that Newton would be superseded by Einstein, and that, a couple of hundred years later, we would actually have some fundamental questions in physics unanswered. He didn't know this, but he wanted to place metaphysics on that type of footing. And he thought he could do this by undertaking this revolution that is analogous to what Copernicus did with the sun and the earth. Copernicus realized that he could make sense of what he was seeing, observing through experience, by thinking of the earth revolving around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the earth. It solved this problem that had not been resolved up to that point. Kant thinks he can do the same thing by saying objects of experience, things that we experience, we tend to think that those are at the center. Those are the bedrock firm reality. And subjects of experience, the experiencing subject, rotates around the object. And he says, why don't we reverse it? Why don't we put the subject at the core, the one who's doing the experiencing, and think of objects as conforming to the subject? This is, it's hard to overstate how mind-blowingly radical this idea is. And I think as we go, why it's so radical will become clear. But that's what we've done up to this point in very broad strokes. And I'm tempted to try to review some of the previous pages, but I think we should really just keep going. So I'm going to jump in right here. This experiment of basically seeing how things work when we undertake this Copernican revolution in metaphysics, it succeeds as well as could be desired, and promises to metaphysics in its first part, the part that is occupied with those concepts a priori, to which the corresponding objects commensurate with them can be given in experience, the secure path of a science. For the new point of view enables us to explain how there can be knowledge a priori. This is really getting to the question of overcoming Humean skepticism. How can there be, for Kant, any a priori knowledge is necessary? This probably is worth sketching out. This is like the other just important diagram to have in mind. Kant draws a very sharp distinction methodologically between what is empirical and what is intelligible. The empirical is called the a posteriori. The intelligible is called the a priori. The empirical is contingent, which means it's not necessary, whereas the a priori is necessary. It can't be otherwise. The empirical could be otherwise. It's sort of optional. It might be this, it might be that. He calls this phenomena, these phenomena, or appearances, while he calls the intelligible noumena, or things in themselves. So this is important just to keep in mind on a methodological level. We can come back to our text. So he's asking how there can be knowledge a priori. How can there be truly necessary knowledge that isn't vulnerable to these Humean critiques? A priori means prior. This is an Aristotelian term. It's not prior to the experience in the sense that I'm just responding to this question in the chat. What does a priori mean? It's not prior to experience in the sense that it happens before experience, but it's prior in the sense that there are certain things that all experience presupposes. Kant will unpack this more in later sessions. So I think for now, if you have this, if you just keep this diagram in mind and remember, examples for what a priori is. Well, Kant's going to say that space and time are a priori, which is kind of hard to wrap your mind around. But he's going to say space and time are necessary categories that we bring to experience. They're not things that we draw out of experience. The laws of mathematics, things like substance and cause and effect, all the things that Hume said you can't prove through experience, Kant's going to say, yes, you're right, you cannot prove it through experience, but it's a necessary framework that we bring to experience. I think we'll unpack this more as we go along. But hopefully that gives you at least some placeholders for the kind of thing that he means. So he's asking how there can be knowledge a priori, necessary knowledge, strict knowledge, and in addition, to furnish satisfactory proofs of the laws which form the a priori basis of nature, regarded as the sum of the objects of experience. So nature is the sum of the objects of experience. He wants to know, how can we furnish proofs for real laws of nature? Neither achievement being possible on the procedure hitherto followed. In other words, prior to Kant's Copernican revolution, you couldn't answer the Humean objections to the whole enterprise of science. So he's saying, sure, you can keep doing science, but the sort of ground principles of science are severely unstable unless you undertake this philosophical Copernican revolution. But this deduction of our power of knowing a priori in the first part of metaphysics has a consequence which is startling, and which has the appearance of being highly prejudicial to the whole purpose of metaphysics as dealt with in the second part. For we are brought to the conclusion that we can never transcend the limits of possible experience, though that is precisely what this science is concerned above all else to achieve. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much for the questions. So he's saying this science, metaphysics, has the goal of transcending the limits of possible experience, in the sense that it asks about things that we can't experience, such as God, such as questions of immortality or freedom. And so that seems like we have a big problem. He's saying, I've destroyed the possibility of doing metaphysics in trying to solve the problem of a priori knowledge in the way that I have. Yeah. Another question, maybe God could be seen as a priori. Yeah, Kant has some very interesting things to say about the idea of God, which I think are generally missed, and I'll come back to this. So this situation yields, however, just the very experiment by which indirectly we are enabled to prove the truth of this first estimate of our a priori knowledge of reason, namely, that such knowledge has to do only with appearances, and must leave the thing in itself as indeed real per se, but is not known by us. This is just such a fundamental idea for Kant. We have knowledge of appearances, phenomena, but we do not have knowledge of things in themselves. For what necessarily forces us to transcend the limits of experience and of all appearances is the unconditioned, which you might not jump to the word God when you see that, but he actually connects up this idea of the unconditioned with the idea of God. Yeah. A comment here, some religious people argue that God is a necessary existence because he is the creator of everything. Yeah, Kant would call this, arguments like this, the cosmological and teleological arguments for God's existence. Now, he's going to say they don't work. And there's another one called the ontological argument, which holds that God's existence is sort of necessary based on the very concept of the idea of God. He's going to reject all of these arguments in a certain way, but he's going to bring back the idea of God in his own way, which we'll come to a little bit today and then more down the road. So God is this, we transcend the limits of experience. I'm sorry, I'm going to read the sentence from the beginning. For what necessarily forces us to transcend the limits of experience and of all appearances is the unconditioned, which reason, by necessity and by right, demands in things in themselves, as required to complete the series of conditions. This is a very Aristotelian idea, and at some point I'll go back to Aristotle and look at what Aristotle has to say about conditions and the unconditioned as a backdrop to what Kant has to say. If then, on the supposition that our empirical knowledge conforms to objects as things in themselves, we find that the unconditioned cannot be thought without contradiction. And that when, on the other hand, we suppose that our representation of things, as they are given to us, does not conform to these things as they are in themselves, but that these objects as appearances conform to our mode of representation, the contradiction vanishes. And if, therefore, we thus find that the unconditioned is not to be met with in things, so far as we know them, that is, so far as they are given to us, but only so far as we do not know them, that is, so far as they are things in themselves, we are justified in concluding that what we first assumed for the purposes of experiment is now definitely confirmed. Okay, excessively long sentence. 3 important parts. First, if we do this and find, I'm going to write this out. If we look at position A, and we find that it leads to contradictions, and if we look at position B, and we find that it resolves the contradictions, we are justified in holding position B. I'm just going to do that. So position A is metaphysics before Kant. And what he's saying is that it leads to go back to the text, metaphysics before Kant thinks that empirical knowledge conforms to objects as things in themselves. And he says this leads to contradictions. On the other hand, if we undertake Kant's Copernican revolution and we think, no, objects as appearances, not things in themselves, conform to our mode of representation, the contradiction goes away. So skip this part. We're justified in concluding that our experiment yielded a sort of productive result, which is that we found a way of resolving the contradiction by reversing our perspective. I'm going to skip this footnote, but he just basically, actually, no, this is quite helpful. So this experiment of pure reason, so he's really viewing himself as a scientist. He's conducting scientific experiments in metaphysics. This experiment of pure reason bears a great similarity to what in chemistry is sometimes entitled the experiment of reduction, or more usually the synthetic process. As far as I understand it in chemistry, what he's referring to is the process of taking a compound and sorting out the elements, reducing them through some chemical process. The analysis of the metaphysician separates pure a priori knowledge into two very heterogeneous elements, namely the knowledge of things as appearances and the knowledge of things in themselves. His dialectic combines these two again in harmony with the necessary idea of the unconditioned demanded by reason, and finds that this harmony can never be obtained except through the above distinction, which must therefore be accepted. He's doing a reduction of our experience, separating out the a priori and the a posteriori, the intelligible and the empirical, and saying these two elements can be clearly and distinctly distinguished. We can separate them out, and I have a method for showing how they fit together into experience in a coherent way that doesn't lead to contradictions. So far, Kant is just telling us about his argument. He's not making the argument. He's just setting us up for what he's going to do and giving us some things to hang on to or hold on to as we navigate. I'm thinking of the image of like taking a raft down some rapids. He's saying, here's your handles. Have this Copernican revolution idea in mind, this idea of reduction in chemistry. Have these things in mind as you navigate the rapids of the rest of my argument in the following, several hundred pages. So let's continue. But when all progress in the field of the supersensible has thus been denied to speculative reason, it is still open to us. So he's saying we can't go into this realm beyond experience with using our speculative reason, our sort of thinking reason. He says it's still open to us to inquire whether in the practical knowledge of reason. So here's another really important distinction that Kant makes. Theoretical reason versus practical reason. All of his work is divided up into theoretical versus practical and empirical versus intelligible. Right now, the critique of pure reason is about the intelligible and the theoretical, but it does get into the practical a little bit, which is kind of where he's taking us right now. So practical reason. In this area, he's asking whether data may not be found sufficient to determine reason's transcendent concept of the unconditioned, and so enable us, in accordance with the wish of metaphysics, and by means of knowledge that is possible a priori, though only from a practical point of view, so not theoretical reason, just practical, to pass beyond the limits of all experience. So he's going to say, another just sort of, I find just sort of mind-blowing point. You can't get there with theoretical reason. You cannot do metaphysics with theoretical reason. You can do it with practical reason. I mean, it's really a crazy point. It really does seem like a truly revolutionary perspective. Speculative reason, by which he means theoretical reason, has thus at least made room for such an extension. And if it must at the same time leave it empty, yet nonetheless we are at liberty, indeed we are summoned to take occupation of it, if we can, by practical data of reason. So we are compelled by reason always to ask these questions about things that go beyond the limits of reason, but beyond the limits of theoretical reason. And now we have this placeholder that practical reason can fill. Snake and eggs, fascinating. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, thanks for the comment. Okay, so what does he say in this footnote? He wants to give us another analogy from the natural sciences to help us out here, because this is really so kind of revolutionary. He says, similarly, the fundamental laws of the motions of the heavenly bodies gave established certainty to what Copernicus had at first assumed only as an hypothesis, and at the same time yielded proof of the invisible force, the Newtonian attraction, which holds the universe together. The latter, Newton's physics, would have remained forever undiscovered if Copernicus had not dared, in a manner contradictory of the senses, but yet true, to seek observed movements. So why contradictory of the senses? Because to us, it looks like the sun rotates around us, rises in the morning and sets in the evening. So Copernicus had to come up with a model that contradicted our sense experience in a way. To seek the observed movements not in the heavenly bodies, but in the spectator. The change in point of view analogous to this hypothesis, which is expounded in the critique, I put forward in this preface as an hypothesis only, in order to draw the attention to the character of these first attempts at such a change, which are always hypothetical. But in the critique itself, it will be proved, apodictically, not hypothetically. So apodictically means absolutely, with absolute certainty, absolute philosophical certainty, from the nature of our representations of space and time, and from the elementary concepts of the understanding. He's really giving us a lot of anticipations of arguments he's going to make in detail. If you're unsatisfied right now, you should be. He's not giving you the full arguments. He's telling you where he's going to end up, and then to actually see how he gets there, you have to read more. Box Draper, what was theoretical reason and practical reason? Yeah, good question. We may want placeholders for this as well. I think some of these terms you're just going to have to get a feel for by reading over time. And Wittgenstein, but what would it have looked like if it had looked as if the Earth was rotating? That's such a good question. I love that. Theoretical and practical reason. The etymology of this word theory is from a Greek word to see. And theoretical reason is reason that sees, that sort of intuits at a glance. If you think about like this idea of a picture being worth 1,000 words, this is what Kant means by intuition. It's something that grasps the whole in a kind of immediate way. And Kant thinks we have that with sensation. We can do that with vision and other senses. There is no intuition with reason, which I think is another way of naming his rejection of metaphysics through theoretical reason. There's no intellectual, theoretical seeing of realities that go beyond our experience. Practical reason is reason as applied to practical matters. So this could include basic things like just means and ends. If you have a goal, how do you achieve it? But for Kant, it's deeper than that. It also includes things like freedom, the capacity to self-determine, and of course, laws of morality, the moral law. And he's going to say that we have these fundamental practical requirements of reason, which push us to sort of presuppose the metaphysical realities that we couldn't establish through theoretical reason. If that's still unclear, I think that's no problem. Those are some basic parameters there, but over time, hopefully that will get filled in further. Okay, so we read this footnote. Yeah, I'm going to keep going. This attempt to alter the procedure which has hitherto prevailed in metaphysics by completely revolutionizing it in accordance. Let me get back to that. So this attempt to alter the procedure which has hitherto prevailed in metaphysics by completely revolutionizing it in accordance with the example set by the geometers and physicists forms indeed the main purpose of this critique of pure speculative reason. And let me address this question from Snake and Eggs. So if I'm following, the Copernican revolution was akin to a paradigm shift from the a posteriori, the Earth is the center of the universe, to the a priori practical reason derived through mathematics. Yeah. I think all the elements there are right, and I think we can tighten that up over time. But I think yes, you are identifying some key elements of this shift. Okay, so this main purpose is to get metaphysics on a scientific path. It is a treatise on the method, not a system of the science itself. So he's saying, here's how this works. I'm not actually spelling out all the details of metaphysics yet, but I'm telling you what it looks like to do that correctly. Take a drink. But at the same time, it marks out the whole plan of the science, both as regards its limits and as regards its entire internal structure. So he is mapping it out. For pure speculative reason has this peculiarity that it can measure its powers according to the different ways in which it chooses the objects of its thinking, and can also give an exhaustive enumeration of the various ways in which it propounds its problems, and so is able, nay bound, to trace the complete outline of a system of metaphysics. So all the objects of reason are available to reason itself. So we don't have to sort of go out and collect data. We have it all internally. As regards the first point, nothing in a priori knowledge can be ascribed to objects save what the thinking subject derives from itself. As regards the second point, pure reason, so far as the principles of its knowledge are concerned, is a quite separate self-subsistent unity, in which, as in an organized body, every member exists for every other, and all for the sake of each, so that no principle can safely be taken in any one relation unless it has been investigated in the entirety of its relations to the whole employment of pure reason. So you really can't correctly identify any part of the sort of inventory of objects that we have from pure reason without knowing all the others. Consequently, metaphysics has also this singular advantage, such as falls to the lot of no other science which deals with objects. For logic is concerned only with the form of thought in general. In other words, logic tells us about thinking itself, but it doesn't give us any objects to think about. So the advantage of metaphysics is that should it, through this critique, be set upon the secure path of a science, it is capable of acquiring exhaustive knowledge of its entire field. We can spell out everything in metaphysics because all the data is available there to reason. Metaphysics has to deal only with principles and with the limits of their employment, as determined by these principles themselves. And it can therefore finish its work and bequeath it to posterity as a capital to which no addition can be made. Since it is a fundamental science, it is under obligation to achieve this completeness. We must be able to say of it, nil actum reputans si quid superesset agendum. I'm going to look that up. Thinking nothing done, if anything remained to be done. But it will be asked, what sort of a treasure is this that we propose to bequeath to posterity? What is the value of the metaphysics that is alleged to be thus purified by criticism and established once for all? On a cursory view of the present work, it may seem that its results are merely negative, warning us that we must never venture with speculative reason beyond the limits of experience. And to be honest, I think if you hear about Kant in an introductory philosophy class or read about him somewhere, you mostly get the negative results. And it's striking to me that Kant says, yes, there are negative implications, but there is also a positive implication. The negative is we must never venture beyond the limits of experience with speculative reason. And he says this is the primary use of what I'm doing. But such teaching at once acquires a positive value when we recognize that the principles with which speculative reason ventures out beyond its proper limits do not in effect extend the employment of reason, but as we find on closer scrutiny, inevitably narrow it. In other words, you make reason worse by using it in the wrong way. These principles properly belong not to reason, but to sensibility. And when thus employed, they threaten to make the bounds of sensibility coextensive with the real, and so to supplant reason in its pure practical employment. So Just as a note, Bounds of Sensibility. This is the title of Peter Strawson's book, The Bounds of Sense on Kant, which I really hope to return to on this in this series. But note that Kant says, I don't want the bounds of sensibility, the bounds of what we can experience through our senses, to be coextensive with the real. That is not the extent of the real. There are real things that are not limited to sense experience. And he says this would supplant reason in its pure practical employment. So far, therefore, as our critique limits speculative reason, theoretical reason, it is negative. But since it thereby removes an obstacle which stands in the way of the employment of practical reason, nay, threatens to destroy it, it has in reality a positive and very important use. At least this is so. Immediately we are convinced that there's an absolutely necessary. This is important for Kant. He thinks that philosophy deals properly. Pure philosophy deals with absolute necessities. And so when he uses this term, he's cluing us in that he thinks there's a foundational, fundamental philosophical principle at work. There's an absolutely necessary practical employment of pure reason, the moral, in which it inevitably goes beyond the limits of sensibility. I'm curious what Peter Strawson makes of this. Though practical reason, in thus proceeding, requires no assistance from speculative reason, it must yet be assured against its opposition, that reason may not be brought into conflict with itself. In other words, we need to make sure that theoretical reason is not trying to do things it can't do, so that it doesn't get into conflict with practical reason doing the things that it's supposed to do. This is also just an absolutely essential component of Kant's idea of reason and philosophical reasoning, which is that reason cannot conflict with itself. This goes back to Aristotle again, the law of non-contradiction, which seems so self-evident. It is. It seems so basic that you cannot assert that the same quality or feature of something is true and not true at the same time in the same way. I'm butchering it a bit, but that's the basic idea. Kant really thinks we can do a lot of work with this idea by saying, by finding out when reason is forced to conflict or contradict itself, and using that as a really important data point for doing philosophical work. So to deny that the service, which the critique renders, is positive in character, would thus be like saying that the police are of no positive benefit, inasmuch as their main business is merely to prevent the violence of which citizens stand in mutual fear, in order that each may pursue his vocation in peace and security. So he's saying, I'm doing this critique of pure reason. Pure reason is another name for speculative or theoretical reason. I'm policing it. I'm setting its boundaries so that practical reason can do what it's supposed to do freely. That space and time are only forms of sensible intuition, and so only conditions of the existence of things as appearances. That moreover, we have no concepts of understanding, and consequently no elements for the knowledge of things, save insofar as intuition can be given corresponding to these concepts, and that we can therefore have no knowledge of any object as thing in itself, but only insofar as it is an object of sensible intuition, that is, in appearance. All this is proved in the analytical part of the critique. If that sentence meant nothing to you, you're good. Thus, it does indeed follow that all possible speculative knowledge of reason is limited to mere objects of experience. Speculative knowledge is limited to experience. But our further contention must also be duly borne in mind, namely that though we cannot know these objects as things in themselves, we must yet be in position at least to think them. So he's distinguishing between knowledge and thinking as things in themselves. Otherwise, we should be landed in the absurd conclusion that there can be appearance without anything that appears. Hey, thank you for the comment. Yeah, greetings from Serbia. Wonderful. My grandmother was Serbian. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for these encouraging comments. I appreciate it, and I'm glad you're here. So let's take a look at this footnote. To know an object, I must be able to prove, and this is where Paul Guyer and Alan Wood are going to use the word cognize, I believe. Erkenntnis or erkennen. This translation from Norman Kemp Smith. Yeah, really, my grandmother was Serbian. She was born in the United States, but yeah. I discussed this in an earlier video, but the translation I'm looking at here is that of Norman Kemp Smith. It's an older translation from 1930s, I think. He uses the word knowledge or to know for erkenntnis and erkennen, whereas the more recent modern translation from 1998, I think, Paul Guyer and Alan Wood uses cognition, which just to me is not the most intuitive translation. I like that Norman Kemp Smith uses the word knowledge. So to know an object, I must be able to prove its possibility, either from its actuality as attested by experience, or a priori by means of reason. So either through reason or through experience. Think back to this, this diagram of rationalism and empiricism, two different ways of acquiring knowledge, through reason or through experience. But I can think whatever I please, provided only that I do not contradict myself. Here's this idea of contradiction again. As long as you are not led into contradictions, you are permitted to think whatever. That is, provided my concept is a possible thought. So Kant thinks that if a thought or an idea leads to contradiction, it is logically impossible, which makes sense. Yes, exactly. These German words, erkennen, erkenntnis, yes. Yeah, famously, there's a sort of a legend that German teachers of Kant's writings recommend their students to read Norman Kemp Smith's English translation in order to understand the German. Okay, so this suffices for the possibility of the concept. The concept is possible if it's free of contradictions. If it has contradictions, it's impossible. Even though I may not be able to answer for there being, in the sum of all possibilities, an object corresponding to it. So just because we've established that an idea or a concept is possible, we don't know that it's actually real. So this may be worth writing out. So if you have a concept, maybe we do this like a sort of tree. If there are contradictions, we know the concept is impossible. If there are no contradictions, we know it's possible, but we still don't know whether it's real. I don't need that question mark. So hopefully that clarifies that a little bit. And an object corresponding to it is what I'm using the word real to describe. So you have a concept, but for it to be real, there has to be an object, a thing that in the world that corresponds to this concept. So something more is required before I can ascribe to such a concept objective validity, that is, real possibility. The former possibility is merely logical. So you get logical possibility if something is free of contradiction, but that's not yet real possibility. Can this be an actual thing in the world? This something more need not, however, be sought in the theoretical sources of knowledge. It may lie in those that are practical. So if you have a concept and it's logically possible because it's free of contradiction, you might try to establish that it's also a real concept using theoretical reason. But Kant's saying we have a second option, we have a backup option, which is that we can also use practical reason to establish the realness of a possible concept. This means the impossible existence, a square circle. Yep, a square circle, a wooden iron. These are just like the sort of stock examples of what an impossible concept would be. Okay, so we read this footnote. Yeah, mental possibility and ontological possibility. Yeah, Kant doesn't use those exact terms, but yes, that's exactly right. So now let us suppose that the distinction, which our critique has shown to be necessary, between things as objects of experience and those same things as things in themselves had not been made. In that case, all things in general, as far as they are efficient causes, would be determined by the principle of causality, and consequently by the mechanism of nature. So if we can't make this distinction that Kant wants to make between things in themselves and appearances, then everything is subject to the laws of nature. I could not, therefore, without palpable contradiction, say of one and the same being, for instance, the human soul, that its will is free and yet is subject to natural necessity, that is not free. So he thinks if you don't make the distinction between things in themselves and appearances, we have a problem, because we want to say that the natural law of cause and effect holds, which includes for human behavior. And we also want to be able to say that human freedom is a real thing. We run into a contradiction unless we make this distinction, which is a classic sort of scholastic move. When you run into a contradiction, make a distinction. For I have taken the soul in both propositions in one and the same sense, namely as a thing in general, that is, as a thing in itself, and save by means of a preceding critique could not have done otherwise. But if our critique is not in error in teaching that the object is to be taken in a twofold sense, namely as appearance and as thing in itself, if the deduction of the concepts of understanding is valid, and the principle of causality therefore applies only to things taken in the former sense, namely insofar as they are objects of experience, these same objects taken in the other sense, not being subject to the principle, then there is no contradiction. In supposing that one and the same will is, in the appearance, that is, in its visible acts, necessarily subject to the law of nature, and so far not free, while yet as belonging to a thing in itself, it is not subject to that law and is therefore free. Wow, interesting question. How much of this was already known to the ancient Greeks? I think so many of these problems are there in Greek philosophy. I do think Kant is doing some things that are genuinely new. And that's partly a result of the three crises I mentioned at the beginning. We have Newtonian physics and Humean skepticism, especially, raising problems in a certain way that were not formulated in those exact ways in ancient Greek philosophy. And I think Kant's solution is truly revolutionary in certain respects. But I think some of these distinctions you will find in Plato and Aristotle. So that's a partial answer that I would like to unpack more as we go. We have not hit the part about denying knowledge to make room for faith, but it is, it's right here. It's on the next page. I'm going to continue for an extra 15 minutes so that I can hit this main point. So my soul viewed from the latter standpoint, and just to summarize this long sentence, he's saying if we don't make this distinction, again, between things in themselves and appearances, we run into a contradiction, because we have to assume that the laws of nature hold, and he thinks we have to assume that freedom is real. And so by making this distinction, we resolve the contradiction. So my soul viewed from the latter standpoint cannot indeed be known by means of speculative reason. We can't use theoretical reason to know the soul, and still less through empirical observation. We can't empirically observe the soul. And freedom as a property of a being to which I attribute effects in the sensible world is therefore also not knowable in any such fashion. So to modern scientists who say freedom is not real, Kant would say, yeah, as far as science goes, it's not an observable phenomenon. But to go back to what he was saying a moment ago, he doesn't want to limit the real to what is scientifically observable. A German philosopher I know often says that most of what we know is nothing new, but a copy of the ancient Greeks only in a new package. I think that's right. I'm strongly inclined to agree with that. So we can't know freedom through experience, through empirical observation. 4, I should then have to know such a being as determined in its existence, and yet as not determined in time, which is impossible, since I cannot support my concept by any intuition. I'm not going to unpack that because it's just, there's a lot presupposed there. But though I cannot know, I can yet think freedom. Back to this distinction. I can think it. It's a logically possible concept. That is to say, the representation of it is at least not self-contradictory, provided due account be taken of our critical distinction between the two modes of representation, the sensible and the intellectual. That's very interesting. He calls these two modes of representation. I think that's worth just kind of using as a framework for this. We're going to call these two modes of representation. In other words, two ways of looking at things. Not necessarily two different things. Like appearances and things in themselves are not two different things. It's two different ways of looking at the same thing. And of the resulting limitation of the pure concepts of understanding and of the principles which flow from them. If we grant that morality necessarily presupposes freedom, that's his argument for free will in a nutshell, is if you don't presuppose free will, morality is sort of breaks apart in the strictest sense as a property of our will. If that is to say, we grant that it yields practical principles, original principles proper to our reason, as a priori data of reason, and that this would be absolutely impossible save on the assumption of freedom. And if at the same time we grant that speculative reason has proved that such freedom does not allow of being thought, then the former supposition, that made on behalf of morality, would have to give way to this other contention, the opposite of which involves a palpable contradiction. So if speculative reason tells us that freedom is a contradictory concept, then practical reason can't go there. For since it is only on the assumption of freedom that the negation of morality contains any contradiction, freedom and with it morality would have to yield to the mechanism of nature. So if freedom is contradictory, then freedom goes, morality goes, and all we have are the laws of nature. Morality does not indeed require that freedom should be understood, but only that it should not contradict itself. So it has to be logically possible, but we don't have to fully understand it through speculative reason. And so should at least allow of being thought. And that, as thus thought, it should place no obstacle in the way of a free act, viewed in another relation, likewise conforming to the mechanism of nature. The doctrine of morality and the doctrine of nature may each therefore make good its position. So he's saying we can have the laws of nature, we can also have freedom. We just have to make this distinction between these two modes of representation, the intelligible and the empirical, the a priori and the a posteriori. This, however, is only possible insofar as criticism has previously established our unavoidable ignorance of things in themselves and has limited all that we can theoretically know to mere appearances. Okay, here's our paragraph that I've been trying to get to. This discussion as to the positive advantage of critical principles of pure reason can be similarly developed in regard to the concept of God and of the simple nature of our soul. But for the sake, so these are, I think these are the three pieces of metaphysics as Kant understands it: freedom, existence of God, and the idea of the soul or immortality. But for the sake of brevity, such further discussion may be admitted. From what has already been said, it is evident that even the assumption as made on behalf of the necessary practical employment of my reason, of God, freedom, and immortality, is not permissible unless at the same time speculative reason be deprived of its pretensions to transcendent insight. So we have to limit speculative or theoretical reason so that practical reason, here's what speculative reason does. One, it tells us you can't go outside certain bounds to make theoretical claims. You cannot transcend experience. It can also tell us the concepts of God, freedom, and immortality are logically possible. What speculative reason cannot do is a third step, and to say that they are real, in fact, that there are objects that correspond to these logical possibilities. However, that third step can be taken by practical reason. That's what Kant is saying. For in order to arrive at such insight, it must make use of principles which in fact extend only to objects of possible experience, and which, if also applied to what cannot be an object of experience, always really change this into an appearance, thus rendering all practical extension of pure reason impossible. We have a comment. My understanding of morality is that it's a set of rules we as a society have agreed upon to make living together work. Theft benefits an individual but harms society because it undermines security and trust. That's why we agree on morality. Yeah, Kant would say that is an empirical description of morality, but he would say there are also a priori necessary laws of practical reason. We're not there yet. I won't try to unpack that further here, but he thinks that there are, just as there are just as there are apodictically necessary principles of pure or speculative reason, there are the same for practical reason. I'm just going to leave it there. Yeah. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I think it helps us start to name what Kant is really trying to do here. I'm going to read this one again. For in order to arrive at such insight, in other words, in order for speculative reason to say things about God, freedom, and immortality, it must make use of principles which in fact extend only to objects of possible experience, and which, if also applied to what cannot be an object of experience, always really change this into an appearance, thus rendering all practical extension of pure reason impossible. And he wants us to be able to do certain things with practical reason. I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. So, by knowledge, he means the use of speculative reason, specifically in these areas of metaphysics that go beyond experience. And he's saying, I'm denying that to make room for the use of practical reason in that realm, and he calls this faith. The dogmatism of metaphysics, that is, the preconception that it is possible to make headway in metaphysics without a previous criticism of pure reason, is the source of all that unbelief, always very dogmatic, which wars against morality. So I think he's actually kind of turning the tables on his critics here, who might say, hey, you're undermining morality by denying that theoretical reason can make these claims. We need it to do that for the sake of morality. And for the sake of like social sort of cohesion, what you were saying about morality and its social function. And Kant is saying, no, by limiting theoretical reason as I have, I actually free up practical reason to establish morality in a truly secure way that previous metaphysics and philosophy have not been able to achieve. I think that is a good place to stop. These couple of paragraphs are kind of relevant to what he's saying here, but we are at an hour and 10 minutes. So to those of you who tuned in, thank you. I'm glad that you were able to be here. And for the comments and questions, extremely grateful. It makes these conversations much richer and I think more interesting. So thanks for weighing in. I hope you'll come back and continue to comment and raise questions. I'll just remind you, if you're interested in going deeper, I will be facilitating an intensive. It's called Cultivating an Intellectual Life. I don't think we're going to read Kant for this one. We'll read other authors on what it means to cultivate an intellectual life, what it means to live an examined life with friends, and what it means to do all of this as a kind of a practice and way of life, not just as an intellectual or academic exercise. So if you're interested, there's a link to express your interest through a Google form in the description. And if you do fill that out, I'll reach out just to meet for 15 or 20 minutes and get to know each other a little better. So thanks. Yeah, thanks, Snake and Eggs. And Nietzsche, as far as I know, views morality as something bad. Yeah, he sees it as a tool of the weak, which they use against the strong. Yep, I think that's right. And Nietzsche hates Kant. So yeah, sometime it would be fun to engage what Nietzsche has to say about all of this. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for joining. Be a wilder. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up here, and hope to see all of you again, and perhaps to connect further through the intensive.